This little boy vanished for 2 years. 2 years of frozen trails, dead ends, and a father convinced he would never see his son alive again. But the entire time, the child was right there, tucked away in a dark crawl space, fed by a 68-year-old grandmother who asked no questions from a mother who refused to let go. When federal agents finally surrounded the house and tore through the walls, the lead agent didn't find a kidnapping victim. He walked straight toward the terrified child and ended a nightmare that nobody believed could have a happy ending. Ricky Chekevdia was 6 years old when he disappeared on a November afternoon. His father had been fighting for custody, accusing the mother of abuse, but his mother and grandmother saw a different threat. They made a choice that turned a custody battle into a secret 2-year disappearance. When federal agents finally broke through the walls of that small Illinois house, they found a hidden compartment, a terrified boy, and a question that no one was prepared to answer. To understand how a 6-year-old boy could vanish without a trace and stay hidden for 2 years, you have to go back to 2007. Back when Ricky Chekevdia was just another kid in southern Illinois, caught between two parents who could not agree on anything except that the other one was dangerous. Mike Chekevdia was a 46-year-old former police officer, a lieutenant colonel in the Illinois National Guard, a man who spent his life enforcing rules and expecting order. Shannon Wilfong was Ricky's mother, younger, and by all accounts terrified. She had accused Mike of sexually abusing their son. The allegations were explosive. State child welfare workers opened an investigation. Ricky was temporarily placed with one of his father's relatives while authorities tried to sort out who was telling the truth. Mike denied everything, and the investigation was inconclusive. But the custody battle was a war with no middle ground. Each parent believed the other was a threat to the child. Only one of them would turn that belief into a plan to make Ricky disappear. On a cold November afternoon, Shannon picked up Ricky and didn't come back. No warning, no note, no phone call. She simply took her son and drove off the map. Mike immediately reported them missing. Police issued alerts, but Shannon had prepared. She was not running alone. She was running to her mother. Diane Dobbs was 51 years old, a grandmother living in a 2-story rural home in Franklin County, about 120 miles southeast of St. Louis. From the outside, it looked like any other agging house on any other quiet road. But inside, Diane had been preparing for a siege. She believed her daughter. She believed her grandson was in danger, and she was willing to do whatever it took to keep him safe from a father she was convinced was a monster. What happened next was not a simple case of a grandmother babysitting a runaway child. It was a carefully constructed disappearance. Inside that house, the windows stayed covered. The shades were always drawn. The boy was not allowed to go outside during the day. The few times he felt sunlight were brief after dark, when neighbors would not be watching. To the outside world, the house looked empty or occupied by a reclusive older woman. But inside, a little boy was growing up in the shadows. The search for Ricky stretched from weeks into months. Mike Chekevdia did everything he could to find his son. He worked with police, hired private investigators, begged the media to keep the story alive. Nothing. Every lead went cold. Every tip turned out to be a dead end. As the first year passed, the case went quiet. Most people assumed Ricky was gone for good, but Mike never stopped believing his son was alive. He just didn't know that the boy was only a few miles away, hidden behind a wall, because the house did not just have closed curtains. It had secret compartments. A panel in the wall that slid open to reveal a crawl space roughly 5 feet wide by 12 feet long, about the height of a washing machine. Inside, there was just enough room for a mother and child to crouch in the dark when someone knocked on the door. It was a hiding place built for the worst-case scenario, and for almost 2 years it worked. But then someone talked. A tip came in, and on September 4, 2009, a team of sheriff's deputies and federal marshals pulled up to Diane Dobbs' house with a search warrant. They didn't know exactly what they were looking for. They just knew that somewhere in that quiet home, a boy who had been missing for 666 days might finally be found. They walked up to the door, they knocked, and then they began to search every inch of that house, unaware that the answer they were hunting was right behind the walls, watching. The marshals moved through the house methodically, room by room, closet by closet. Diane Dobbs stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, saying very little. She didn't look like a criminal mastermind. She looked like a tired grandmother who had not slept well in a very long time. But the agents had a tip, a credible one, from someone who had finally decided to break the silence. and they were not leaving until they turned every inch of that house inside out. It was the wall in a back bedroom that did not sound right when they knocked, hollow where it should have been solid. One of the deputies ran his hand along the edge and felt the seam. A panel painted to blend in, exactly the color of the rest of the wall. He pried it open. Inside, the space was roughly 5 feet wide by 12 feet long, about the height of a washing machine, dark, cramped, and hot. And in that tiny compartment, crouched in the shadows, were two people. Shannon Wilfong, 30 years old, pale and trembling, and pressed against her, a small boy with wide brown eyes who had not been seen by anyone outside that house for 666 days. The lead agent leaned in. He didn't shout. He just said quietly, "It's okay, you're safe now, come on out." The boy looked at his mother, she nodded. And then Ricky Chekevdia, 6 years old, missing for almost 2 years, crawled out of the darkness and into the light. He was not the frightened, withdrawn child the agents expected. He was talkative, polite, curious. He asked questions. He wanted to know who everyone was. He was in very good spirits for a boy who had spent nearly 2 years hidden from the world. But what he said next brought the room to a standstill. A state police master sergeant knelt down and asked Ricky a simple question. "Do you ever get to go outside?" The boy looked up and answered without hesitation, "Never." Later, when they let him out of the patrol car at the sheriff's office, Ricky did something that broke every officer who saw it. He ran, in circles, across the parking lot. Through the grass, arms out, face tilted toward the sky, like a child who had never felt grass under his feet or sunlight on his skin without fear. One of the investigators would later tell reporters that it was actually very sad. The boy ran around like he had never seen the outdoors. Mike Chekevdia got the phone call that afternoon. He was a hardened former cop, a lieutenant colonel in the National Guard, a man not easily shaken. But when he heard that his son was alive, that Ricky was safe, that after 2 years of nothing he was finally coming home, Mike broke down. He would later tell reporters a single sentence that captured the agony of every parent whose child has been stolen. 2 years, you have no idea. But as the relief settled in, a darker question began to surface. Why had this happened, and who was truly to blame? Shannon Wilfong and Diane Dobbs were arrested immediately. Shannon was charged with felony child abduction. Diane was charged with aiding and abetting. But when they spoke from jail and later on national television, they told a very different story than the one the agents had assumed. They did not see themselves as kidnappers. They saw themselves as protectors. Diane Dobbs looked straight into a camera on Good Morning America and said her grandson had the run of the house, that the crawl space was where he spent maybe 5 minutes total in 2 years. That they went fishing, that they did weenie roasts, that they planted flowers in the backyard and watched fireworks on the 4th of July. She claimed the hidden compartment was just a precaution, not a prison. And the reason for all of it, the reason she and her daughter had vanished with a 6-year-old boy and stayed hidden for nearly 2 years, was one single, devastating allegation. Shannon Wilfong had accused Ricky's father of sexually abusing the child. The accusations had been made before the disappearance, during the custody battle. They had been investigated, and they had been rejected by authorities as unsubstantiated. But Shannon and Diane never accepted that. They believed with absolute certainty that Mike Chekevdia was a danger to Ricky, that the system had failed, and that they had no choice but to take matters into their own hands. Diane told a local newspaper that her daughter had been forced into hiding to keep the child from his father. "We were on our own," she said, "and we had to do what we had to do, and that was make sure our grandson was safe." It was a defense that gave even the most hardened observers pause. If a mother genuinely believes her child is being abused, what is she supposed to do when the courts don't believe her? Is hiding a crime, or is it the only weapon left? Those questions would hang over the courtroom like a storm cloud. But there was another side to the story. A side the investigators found in the house itself. The windows had been covered for so long that the shades were stiff from disuse. There were multiple hidden compartments, not just one, a hole in the floor, another carved into the wall behind a dresser. This was not a home where a child ran freely and occasionally hid. This was a home designed for concealment. And Ricky, despite his grandmother's claims, had told the officers himself that he never went outside. The boy was not just hidden. He was isolated. For 2 years, his world had been the inside of that house, and the people who loved him most had kept him there, convinced they were saving him from something worse. As Ricky was reunited with his father and the legal system began to grind forward, the case would force everyone involved to confront an impossible question. Can a grandmother who hides a child for 2 years be a criminal and a protector at the same time? And when the truth finally emerged about what really happened inside that house, it would change everything anyone thought they knew about the line between right and wrong. The case against Shannon Wilfong and Diane Dobbs looked open and shut. 2 adults, 1 child, hidden for nearly 2 years. A secret compartment, covered windows, a boy who said he never went outside. The charges were serious: felony child abduction, aiding and abetting. If convicted, both women faced years in prison. But the moment they stepped into the legal system, the simple narrative cracked wide open. Shannon's defense attorney did not deny the facts. Yes, she took Ricky. Yes, she hid him. Yes, she broke the law. But then he asked the jury a question that turned the courtroom into a moral battleground. What would you do if you believed your child was being abused and no one would listen? The allegations against Mike Chekevdia had been investigated by the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services before the disappearance. The caseworkers had interviewed Ricky. They had interviewed both parents. They had examined medical records and talked to teachers and relatives. In the end, the agency classified the allegations as unfounded. There was not enough evidence to prove abuse, and Ricky was returned to a neutral placement with a paternal relative. But unfounded does not always mean false. Sometimes it means unprovable. And Shannon Wilfong believed with every cell in her body that the system had failed. She was not alone. Diane Dobbs, the grandmother, became the public face of the defense. In jailhouse interviews and on national morning shows, she painted a picture of a mother and grandmother forced into hiding because they had run out of options. She claimed Ricky was happy, that the crawl space was rarely used, that he played, laughed, and was loved. She said the secret compartments were for his safety, not his imprisonment. We had to do what we had to do, she told ABC News, and that was make sure our grandson was safe. But the more Diane talked, the more questions emerged. She said Ricky had only been in the crawl space for maybe 5 minutes in 2 years. She said he had the run of the house. Yet when investigators searched the property, they found multiple hidden areas, not just one: a hole in the floor, a cavity carved behind a dresser. The windows were so thoroughly blocked that neighbors had assumed the house was vacant, and Ricky himself had told the officers who rescued him that he never went outside. The contradictions were impossible to ignore. Then the boy's own words began to surface. After his rescue, Ricky underwent a series of interviews with child psychologists. He was bright, articulate, and deeply confused about why his mother and grandmother were in trouble. He did not see himself as a victim of abduction. He saw himself as a child who had been kept safe from danger. But he also described a life of extreme isolation. No school, no friends his own age, no trips to the park or the grocery store, no doctor visits. His entire world had been the 4 walls of that house and the 2 women who loved him enough to keep him hidden from the rest of the world. For Ricky's father, the reunion was both a miracle and a nightmare. Mike Chekevdia had spent 2 years imagining the worst. He had buried his son in his mind 100 times. When he finally held Ricky again, he wept. But the boy he got back was not the same child who had vanished at age 4. Ricky had been raised in isolation by a mother who had told him his father was dangerous. The boy was affectionate but guarded. He asked about his mother constantly. He did not understand why he could not go home. Mike had to rebuild his relationship with his son while fighting a public relations war. The abuse allegations, though legally unsubstantiated, had been spread by the grandmother's media tour. In small-town Illinois, people whispered. Some believed the father was a monster. Others believed the mother was a manipulator who had brainwashed a child. The truth, as it always is, was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. As the trial approached, prosecutors faced an unexpected problem. The star witness was a 6-year-old boy who loved the defendants and did not believe they had done anything wrong. Putting Ricky on the stand would be traumatic. Keeping him off the stand meant relying on physical evidence and testimony from law enforcement. The case would turn not on whether Shannon and Diane had hidden Ricky, but on whether their actions were criminal or justified. And that question had no easy answer. Then, just as the trial date was set, a bombshell dropped. A forensic psychologist who had evaluated the family submitted a sealed report. Details were kept confidential for years, but fragments eventually leaked. The report suggested that the mother's belief in the abuse was not based in delusion or malice, but in what she perceived as genuine threats. It also noted concerning patterns in Ricky's attachment to his captors, patterns consistent with long-term isolation and maternal gatekeeping. In other words, the report said both things at once. The mother was not crazy, and the child had been psychologically harmed anyway. The courts would have to decide which mattered more. The case was on a knife's edge. Conviction meant sending a grandmother and a mother to prison for protecting a child they believed was in danger. Acquittal meant sending a message that taking the law into your own hands was acceptable if you were scared enough. The judge, the jury, and the entire community were about to find out which way the scales would tip. And the answer would change not just one family's life, but how the entire country thought about parental rights, child protection, and the terrible gray space in between. In the end, the case never went to a jury. After months of pretrial hearings and the looming threat of a public trial that would drag Ricky through painful testimony, Shannon Wilfong accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of unlawful restraint. The felony child abduction charge was dropped. Diane Dobbs, the grandmother, pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice. Neither woman went to prison. The sentences were probation and mental health counseling. The judge made it clear that what they did was a crime, but also acknowledged the impossible circumstances. A mother who believed her child was being abused, a grandmother who believed her daughter, a system that had failed to give them a definitive answer they could trust. The court did not excuse the hiding, but it recognized the fear behind it. For Shannon, the real punishment was losing her son. Custody was awarded to Mike Chekevdia. She could see Ricky only through supervised visitation, gradually and only after he had stabilized in his new life. It was the part of the sentence that no judge had to hand down. It was the consequence of 2 years in the dark. Ricky moved in with his father, a man he barely knew, in a house that felt foreign and too quiet. The father who had been painted as a monster was now the only parent on the other side of the door. Mike Chekevdia did what he could. He enrolled Ricky in school. He got him into therapy. He tried to answer the questions his son asked about why his mother was not there, why he could not go back to the house with the secret rooms. But rebuilding was slow. Ricky had been taught for 2 years that the outside world was dangerous, that his father was a threat, that the only safe place was a small house with drawn shades. Those lessons do not vanish overnight. At night, Ricky would sometimes cry for his mother. During the day, he was bright and talkative, the same boy the officers had seen running in the parking lot. But the joy was layered over a foundation of grief he did not yet have words for. Mike had to learn how to be a father to a son he had missed for nearly half the boy's life. He was no longer a former cop looking for a missing child. He was a single parent trying to prove, one bedtime story and one packed lunch at a time, that he was not the enemy. Years passed. The headlines faded. The house in Franklin County was sold. The secret compartments were sealed up and forgotten by everyone except the people who had hidden inside them. Shannon and Diane rebuilt their lives quietly. They never stopped believing they had done what was necessary. In interviews years later, Diane still insisted that protecting her grandson was not a crime in her heart, even if it was on paper. And Ricky grew up. He went through elementary school, middle school, high school. He made friends. He played sports. He became a teenager, then a young man. Those who knew him said he carried the experience lightly, but it was always there underneath. He remembered the crawl space. He remembered his grandmother's arms pulling him close when footsteps came to the door. He remembered the day the agents pulled back the panel and the sun hit his face. He called it his second birthday. The most surprising detail came years later, quietly, without cameras. Ricky maintained a relationship with his mother and grandmother. Not close, not the same as before, but present. He forgave them, not because what they did was right, but because he understood why they did it. He had grown old enough to know that love and harm can live in the same house, sometimes in the same hug. Mike Chekevdia, the father who had spent 2 years in agony, who had been accused of unspeakable things that were never proven, made a choice that surprised everyone. He did not stand in the way of that relationship. He allowed Ricky to know the women who had hidden him, because Mike had learned something during those years of searching, something that a court could never rule on. His son had been taken, but he had also been loved. And if there was any chance for Ricky to become whole, it would come from holding both truths at once. The case of Ricky Chekevdia did not set a legal precedent. It did not change custody laws. It did not rewrite the rules about how we protect children from parents or parents from the system, but it forced everyone who encountered it to sit with a question that refuses to resolve. Can a grandmother who hides a child for 2 years be both a criminal and a hero? Can love be the motive for a terrible wrong? And when the law fails to protect the most vulnerable, Who gets to decide what comes next? These are not easy questions, and that is exactly the point. Most of us walk through life believing we can tell the difference between right and wrong at a glance. A grandmother who hides a child for 2 years, a mother who takes her son off the grid. Those sound like villains, but then you hear the fear in their voices. You see the system that couldn't give a definitive answer. You meet a little boy who loved his grandmother and his mother even after everything, and the story refuses to stay simple. Ricky Chekevdia is an adult now. He has lived a life on the other side of the crawlspace door. His father got his son back, but not the years. His mother never went to prison, but she lost the child she fought to keep. The grandmother who said she had to do what she had to do spent her final years knowing she had done it. And the rest of us are left with a question that has no answer. If you knew with absolute certainty that a child was in danger and no one was listening, what would you do? Would you follow the law, or would you hide the child yourself? Where is the line between protector and criminal, and who gets to draw it? I want to hear your answer in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that children deserve a system that never fails them, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the hardest stories are the ones that don't give us a hero and a villain. They give us people and leave the judgment to us.